Is there anything? Is there anything?
A bitch.
Breaking news tonight. The Department of Defense has confirmed a significant breach of federal networks. This timeline shows the attack vectors used by the...
At 6:11 a.m., inside a sealed federal briefing room in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a single sentence echoed across the microphones, $2.1 billion. Traced, seized, shut down. No questions followed. No names were repeated, only numbers, 14 states, hundreds of registered child care nonprofits, thousands of falsified enrollment records, and a fraud network so deeply embedded that federal investigators would later describe it as the most complex social services infiltration ever uncovered on U.S. soil. This was not a street cartel. There were no masked gunmen or desert convoys, no tunnels, no border chases. This was a white-collar cartel, hidden behind daycare doors, protected by paperwork, and shielded by silence. And as disturbing as that sounded, what followed was worse. It began at 4:29 a.m. The Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan area lay frozen under winter darkness. Snow-covered empty parking lots. Sodium streetlights buzzed faintly. Fluorescent bulbs flickered above buildings marked Child Learning Center and Community Youth Care. Not a single child had ever walked inside. At exactly 4:29, unmarked vans rolled into position without sirens. FBI agents stepped out first, moving with controlled urgency. DEA financial crimes units followed, carrying evidence kits instead of weapons. IC intelligence teams sealed exits. SWAT units stacked silently at doors. This was not one raid. It was dozens. Converted warehouses, strip mall offices, vacant industrial buildings registered as daycare facilities. The first door came down with a hydraulic ramp. Flashbangs detonated in empty hallways. Filing cabinets crashed to the floor. Suspects froze mid-run, clutching laptops, phones, and external hard drives. In one location, agents entered what paperwork described as a nursery. The walls were painted with cartoon animals. Tiny plastic chairs sat in neat rows. Behind a false wall, server racks hummed steadily. By sunrise, preliminary numbers flooded into the command channel. More than 200 encrypted hard drives, dozens of private servers, nearly $193 million in immediately accessible funds, and documents tying over 780 daycare nonprofits into one coordinated system. This was not chaos, it was design. At 9:52 a.m., inside an FBI cyber forensics lab, analysts cracked the first encryption layer. A massive network diagram spread across the screens. Shell nonprofits fed shell corporations. Corporations routed funds through offshore accounts. Accounts cycled money back into federal child care subsidy programs. Money moved in perfect circles. The operation had a name, non-RCROVL. This was not accidental fraud. This was not mismanagement. This was engineered. At the center of every delayed audit, every suppressed alert, every rewritten compliance report, one digital authorization appeared again and again. Elliot R. Hargrove. Publicly, Hargrove was invisible. A senior federal oversight administrator with no public profile and no political ambition. He never gave interviews. He never appeared at press conferences inside the system. His approval meant everything. When auditors flagged impossible enrollment numbers, Hargrove delayed reviews. When whistleblowers reported non-existent children, Hargrove reassigned the reports. When algorithms detected abnormal financial flows, Hargrove raised alert thresholds. He did not erase evidence. He buried it beneath procedure. For nearly 6 years, most major compliance decisions passed through his office. Investigators would later describe his role in a single sentence. This was not corruption. This was protection. By 3:14 a.m. the following morning, the investigation expanded. A federal command center lit up with a massive digital map. Red markers pulsed across the Midwest, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth-Madison, Chicago logistics corridors, East Coast grant processing hubs. More than 1,000 federal agents were mobilized across agencies. This was no longer an investigation, this was eradication. And what agents were about to uncover next would prove that daycare fraud was only the surface layer of something far more dangerous. At 3:22 a.m., the digital map hovering above the operations floor pulsed brighter. Red markers multiplied across the Midwest, then spilled outward like an infection spreading through arteries. Each dot represented a front company. Each line represented money in motion. Each timestamp represented how close the system had come to becoming permanent. Federal analysts worked in silence, fingers moving across keyboards, eyes fixed on cascading data. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the daycare cartel had not simply stolen money. It had learned how to hide inside time. Audit schedules were not canceled. They were delayed just long enough to expire. Inspection teams were not blocked. They were redirected. Compliance alerts were not ignored. They were reclassified. This was not brute force corruption. It was finesse. At 4:01 a.m., a senior analyst froze the room with a single observation. "These nonprofits don't just receive money," she said. "They control movement." The room leaned in. Shipping manifests tied to meal reimbursements revealed leased trucks. Fuel grants overlapped with transportation contracts. Warehouse rent was justified as temporary childcare expansion. Daycare funding had become a logistics backbone, and it was already active. At 4:18 a.m., authorization was given. Phase 2 would begin before sunrise across multiple states. Federal teams moved simultaneously. Not loud, not dramatic, precise. FBI agents entered financial offices posing as inspectors. DEA financial units served sealed warrants at processing firms. ICE intelligence teams intercepted data transfers midstream. SWAT units secured high-risk locations where evidence destruction was likely. In Madison, agents shut down a nonprofit that claimed to serve 800 children but employed only 2 people. In Duluth, a warehouse registered as an after-school center was found storing shipping pallets and fuel drums. Outside Chicago, a logistics contractor tied to 3 daycare nonprofits attempted to wipe servers as agents breached the door. By 7:40 a.m., seizures eclipsed the night before. Hundreds of millions more frozen. Entire corporate trees collapsed. Communication hubs went dark. But the most dangerous discovery came quietly. Inside a secured server cluster, analysts uncovered a pattern of law enforcement interference. Patrol routes altered minutes before inspections. Way stations under maintenance during specific transport windows. Internal memos warning of budget shortages that conveniently delayed oversight. This was not accidental overlap. This was coordination. At least 27 mid-level officials across multiple agencies had accepted consulting fees, speaking contracts, or advisory retainers tied that back to cartel-linked nonprofits. No threats, no violence, just money. As one investigator put it later, they didn't buy the badge. They rented the silence. By mid-morning, attention returned to the name that refused to disappear. Elliot R. Hargrove. At 12 a.m., agents executed a quiet arrest warrant at his office. There were no cameras, no hallway chaos. Just 2 agents, a badge, and a sentence. "Sir, you need to come with us." Hargrove stood calmly, straightened his jacket, collected his phone and keys. He did not resist. As they walked him out, he glanced once at the monitors still displaying compliance dashboards. Then he asked a question that unsettled everyone who heard it. "How long did it take you to see it?" During interrogation, Hargrove never denied his actions. He spoke in neutral language, describing systems, efficiencies, and constraints. He called safeguards outdated friction, and audits rituals designed to comfort, not protect. He did not frame himself as a criminal. He framed himself as an optimizer. In his private notes, seized later, he wrote that oversight was the illusion of safety, and that real control required fewer obstacles, not more. He believed the system had invited exploitation by pretending it was stronger than it was. The final file on his server was labeled simply E Phase 3. It outlined a long-term plan to convert nonprofit infrastructure into permanent corridors for illicit movement. Narcotics would follow humanitarian routes. Migrant smuggling would hide behind social services. Human trafficking support would be buried beneath compliance paperwork. Childcare had been the proving ground, and it had worked. Back in the command center, the realization settled in with weight. This was not about money anymore. It was about who controlled the system. And as agents prepared the next wave of actions, one truth became unavoidable. If Phase 3 had activated, the cartel would not have needed violence. It would have owned the process. And stopping it now meant exposing just how close the system had come to surrendering without a fight. By late afternoon, the investigation stopped being regional. It went national. Inside the Federal Operations Center, the map zoomed out. Midwest markers faded into a larger picture, revealing connections stretching east and south. Shipping lanes, grant corridors, data transfers hopping state lines in carefully timed bursts. What looked like isolated fraud was now clearly a national infrastructure. Analysts tracked how nonprofit entities in Minnesota coordinated with shell foundations in neighboring states. Money moved first as child care subsidies, then reclassified as transportation support, then quietly merged into logistics budgets tied to community development. No alarms triggered, because everything looked legal. At 5:06 p.m., a breakthrough froze the room. A recovered email thread referenced a directive labeled "Quiet Window." It instructed recipients to expect reduced oversight for 48 hours due to system maintenance. That window aligned perfectly with a surge in high-value transfers. Someone inside government systems had coordinated timing. This was no longer a cartel hiding from the state. This was a cartel using the state. Investigators pulled internal access logs. Patterns emerged immediately. Login credentials used from restricted terminals. Approval chains bypassed standard review steps. Inspection reports signed without visits ever occurring. By evening, arrests expanded. Federal agents detained a deputy compliance director in one state, a senior grant coordinator in another, a logistics planner who had quietly shifted public resources for years. Some broke immediately, others stayed silent. What they revealed shattered remaining illusions. The cartel had built a parallel enforcement layer, not armed, not visible, but effective. When inspectors asked too many questions, they were reassigned. When auditors pushed too hard, budgets were cut. When whistleblowers refused to stop, their reports vanished into extended review. No threats were made. The system did the work. At 7:42 p.m., agents reviewed intercepted communications between nonprofit executives. The language was chilling in its calm, movement approved. Compliance neutralized BOP. Window confirmed. This was not desperation. This was confidence. In another secure room, agents examined financial flow projections tied to Phase 3. The numbers were staggering. Once fully activated, the system could move tons of narcotics per week without triggering alerts. Trucking routes overlapped with food distribution programs. Way stations were scheduled for maintenance at precise intervals. Migrant smuggling corridors were embedded inside social service transport plans. Human trafficking support operations hid behind temporary housing grants. Everything wore a humanitarian mask. This was not infiltration. This was reprogramming. As night fell, a realization settled across the teams working the case. If this structure had survived another year, dismantling it might have been impossible without collapsing legitimate services alongside it. The cartel had engineered dependency. At 9:15 p.m., a senior federal official addressed the room quietly. "We are not chasing criminals anymore," he said. "We are racing a system." The next wave of action began immediately. Emergency court orders authorized unprecedented seizures. Entire nonprofit networks were frozen overnight. Bank accounts across multiple states were locked simultaneously to prevent cascade withdrawals. Phones lit up across the country. Nonprofit administrators panicked. Logistics partners cut contact. Consultants disappeared. But the damage could not be fully undone. In interviews, honest officials described the same emotion again and again. Betrayal. They had believed in process. They had trusted oversight. They had followed the rules. And the rules had been weaponized against them. One investigator summarized it best. "This cartel didn't fight the system," he said. "It studied it." As midnight approached, analysts reviewed one final dataset recovered from Hargrove's archives. It was not financial. It was psychological, risk tolerance charts, oversight fatigue models, timelines predicting when compliance teams would stop pushing back. The cartel had calculated not just money flows, but human limits, and it had been right. As Part 3 closed, one truth stood undeniable. The raid had stopped Phase 3. But it had also exposed something far more dangerous. The system had almost agreed to surrender, and rebuilding trust would be harder than seizing money. By the time dawn approached again, the system was no longer resisting. It was unraveling. Across federal buildings, emergency protocols replaced routine operations. Phones rang without pause. Compliance teams worked through the night, rewriting rules that had stood untouched for decades. Temporary safeguards were rushed into place, not to improve efficiency, but to slow everything down. Speed had been the cartel's greatest weapon. Now it was the government's greatest risk. At 5:48 a.m., the final coordinated freeze was executed. Remaining nonprofit accounts were locked. Logistics contracts were suspended mid-route. Warehouses linked to humanitarian programs were sealed with federal notices posted on their doors. Truck convoys turned around on highways. Transfers failed mid-transaction. Entire networks went silent. The collapse was quiet, no explosions, no sirens, no headlines screaming chaos, just a sudden absence of movement. Inside interrogation rooms, those arrested finally understood what had happened. The protection they believed permanent was gone. The process they had relied on no longer shielded them. Some tried to negotiate. Others blamed the system itself. A few admitted the truth. They had never believed they would be stopped. Because the cartel had not operated like criminals. It had operated like administrators. Elliot R. Hargrove was informed of the final freezes shortly after sunrise. He listened without visible reaction. When told Phase 3 was dead, he closed his eyes briefly. Not in anger, in calculation. He knew what it meant. The system had rejected him. During his final recorded interview, Hargrove said something investigators would never forget. "I didn't break the system," he said. "I removed the fiction around it." To him, safeguards were theater. Oversight was ritual, and silence was proof of consent. He believed the system would always choose convenience over confrontation. In many ways, he had been right. As the investigation wrapped, officials compiled damage assessments. Billions had been intercepted before full activation, but billions more had already flowed through fake entities, never to be recovered. Legitimate nonprofits faced scrutiny, forced to prove innocence in an environment poisoned by doubt. The collateral damage was real and unavoidable, but so was the alternative. If Phase 3 had activated fully, the cartel would not have needed to expand. It would have lasted, quietly, permanently, embedded so deeply that dismantling it would have collapsed essential services alongside it. That outcome had been prevented by weeks, maybe days. Inside the command center, a senior agent summarized the case in a single sentence. "This wasn't about money," he said. "It was about permission. Permission granted slowly, quietly, through fatigue and trust and routine. As files were closed and arrests processed, attention turned to rebuilding. Oversight would be slower now, more painful, more visible. But no one argued against it. Speed had nearly cost everything. The final press briefing was deliberately restrained. No dramatic language, no celebration. Just confirmation that safeguards were being rebuilt and investigations were ongoing. Behind the scenes, one directive was repeated again and again. Never let silence replace scrutiny. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones attacked from the outside. They are the ones redesigned from within. This story is fictional, but the warning is not. Power does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with approvals, with ignored alerts, with the quiet belief that someone else is watching. If you are still listening, remember this: systems fail when accountability becomes optional. Share this story so silence does not win again. And comment EXPAS if you believe corruption should never be allowed to hide behind institutions.